Hello and good evening, I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider the news of the day. Let's begin with news with Joe Low. The wanted businessman gave an email interview to Singapore's The Straits Times, which was published today. Now, in that interview, Joe Low denied being a mastermind. In fact, he said he was only an introducer and an intermediary. He said he was being made a scapegoat for the 1MDB scandal and would not return to Malaysia as he did not believe he would receive a fair trial. What do you make of that interview?
Well, it's fascinating because this is really not news in the sense that, Joe Low, I think, has been quite consistent in portraying himself as an innocent victim of, domestic politics in Malaysia, so on and so forth. And this is, if it goes back, if you remember that Euro Money interview he gave many years ago. But I think, Melissa, what's interesting about this is really the circumstances, right? It's why has the Straits Times Singapore given him this platform to say what he wants? The question is also, why didn't they push back on some of his claims? Well, and this is something The Edge does, isn't it?
That's right. Well, okay, so to that comment that you said about why didn't they push back, now that interview has been commented on. I think the co-author of Billion Dollar Whale, which was about the 1MDB scandal, said that that interview was pointless. The comments made were, didn't really answer the questions that were asked, and the questions themselves left a lot, was lacking in some sense. In fact, The Edge had said, had called out the Straits Times, saying that it was nonsensical spin, and he has in a comment that they put out, they said, "Stop the nonsensical spin you're doing with help from your friends at the Singapore Straits Times." Strong words there from The Edge.
But The Edge and the Straits Times have gone head-to-head on many issues around 1MDB and Joe Low in particular, also, in the past. But what's interesting about the response from The Edge, Melissa, I think, is also some of the claims that they make, right? So one of the things they do is that they debunk Joe Low's claims about innocence, saying why, for instance, didn't he fight the Department of Justice's, seizure of his property if he was innocent, believing that the U.S., the bastion of, judicial independence, he could have fought a fair trial there. Now, but they do go on to say that in this question of who's the principal and who's the intermediary, they believe that, in fact, the former Prime Minister, they allege the former Prime Minister, Najib Razak, and Joe Low worked in cahoots. Basically, they were both principals in this, and one was not subordinate to the other.
Do you think, Sharaad, that media should be calling out other media for not asking the right questions?
Well, I think so. Melissa, when it's very apparent that a media organization is using itself as a platform to float certain ideas or to provide a defense of particular individuals, I think it seems to me perfectly reasonable to call them out. And we know that many newspapers do in fact have links to governments or interest groups, and they become the voice for that. So with the Straits Times Singapore, of course, the suggestion seems to be that somehow the Singapore government is approved this line when it comes to Joe Low and the 1MDB issue.
Well, we also have to think about the question of timing. Why did Joe Low decide to say yes to this email interview now after many years? I believe it's been 4 years since he has made an appearance in the media with any kind of official interview. So I think those are the questions that we should consider tonight. But
But before we go on, another thing that the Straits Times does allow, as The Edge puts up, allow Joe Low to claim is that he's in the Middle East. And when they believe, and I don't know what basis they believe this, that he's in fact in China.
That's
right.
right.
That's another thing that I think is fascinating. I would urge everybody to read the Edge response.
The Edge's rebuttal to saying that they wanted to ask Joe Low the obvious questions that the Straits Times of Singapore did not ask. All right, let's move on to the poor maintenance of our public transport facilities. Now, Transport Minister Anthony Loke says he is disappointed with the culture that the culture of better maintenance has not been instilled among transport service providers. Now, he was particularly unhappy after a spot check at the Kuala Lumpur KTM station today when he found only 1 out of 4 ticketing machines to be functioning. There you go.
Well, if you, like myself, take public transport, Melissa, you know that many things don't necessarily function. I think actually our public transport system and the services are generally quite good. I use it on a regular basis. But there's 2 things that come to mind. This is also part of our political culture where a minister does a spot check.
Right.
And you can't keep a system running if the minister has to do spot checks.
What do you think about spot checks? I mean, isn't that a way to keep everyone on their toes, but the boss might come and visit?
Yes, but this is not the boss. This is the boss's boss.
The boss's boss.
I mean, it's the ultimate, boss. And you can't run a country if the prime minister is the only one that strikes fear in, in the people who run the system. And they must have a system of maintenance and checks and balances and informing on what has been, not provided or what has malfunctioned. It cannot be happening because the minister comes there. Nevertheless, it's a wake-up call. But like in so many wake-up calls, people press snooze. So the question is, Melissa,
you and I included.
Yes, I mean, Melissa, the problem of maintenance culture in Malaysia, is this new?
Yeah, no, it's not. But the point that the minister is trying to make is that we should be looking to instill a culture of better maintenance among our service providers. Now, I'm just wondering, how do we go about doing this? Where does the onus lie? Whose responsibility is it to provide, to maintain, I guess, or to provide that better maintenance? Because as users of public transport or public goods, it is also, the onus is also on us to make sure that we don't destroy these public goods. I remember, there were many stories about, days after MRT stations opened or the Lake Gardens opened once again to the public, you'd see public infrastructure being destroyed. Do we deserve to have nice things?
Well, I mean, I talk about, ticketing machines. I mean, I seriously doubt that this is a problem of people either vandalizing those machines. Because if you actually use the system, they're quite solid machines.
Right.
It would take a pretty hard thumping to destroy them. I think the issue here, really has to do with who in the station, what is your hierarchical structure in which somebody says, okay, if something is not working, it's then reported, and the question is, the person is reported to, do they act fast enough, right? And so on and so forth. I mean, these are just, systems you put in place. I mean, the fact that a minister has to come down for, everybody to wake up, I think is extraordinary.
All right, let's turn our attention now to the bushfires in Australia. Rain has fallen in fire-ravaged parts of Australia and temperatures have dropped. However, officials have warned that temperatures could rise once again to create an even larger mega blaze. Now, Malaysia has offered to help Australia tackle this disaster, but is it going to be enough?
Well, Melissa, I think when you see just this extent of the destruction, you've seen satellite pictures of the burning that's taken from the stratosphere or from satellites. I mean, it is in fact extraordinary and very sad because we're talking about millions and millions of animals lost, right. Both, who are part of the commercial agricultural sector and also just wildlife. And the question is whether what are the prospects for regeneration?
Right.
Because we know that this is not, now we know actually from histories that have been given to us, that this is not the first time it's happened on the continent. Australia, of course, is well known for being a dry continent. It's really the question of political responses, systems, again, either working or not working.
Right. Well, apparently there's been a fund that's been put together. So the Prime Minister has said that they were going to use taxpayers' money to spend, to tackle this, I think $1.4 billion of taxpayers' money for a national recovery fund. Now, the question is, as we turn our attention to Australia and we look at what's happening there, I know many Malaysians have offered to help or feel that this story resonates with them, that the disaster resonates with them because we know we have links to Australia through family or studies or businesses. But the question is, what can Malaysia learn from this? Are we future-proofing ourselves enough in case there are climate-related disasters here on our land?
Right. I mean, the other thing that's really fascinating is, and saddening in some ways. This is a country that many Malaysians, former Malaysians, now call their home. Many Malaysians, for whatever reason, aspire to move to or work or live or
the land of milk and honey,
study,
isn't it?
study in Australia. But even affluent countries, democratic countries, countries that seem to, in many ways, at least politically, got themselves sorted, can still, be in denial about their responsibilities to the environment and put themselves in such a horrendous mess. 650 is the measurement of the air pollution index in Canberra, which of course is the capital city. I mean, this was something that Sarawak suffered in the worst of the haze. It is choking. It is very sad. So you don't look after your environment, you're in for big trouble.
That's right. The planet is all we have. Now, after this, folks, we're going to take a closer look at the US-Iran tensions after the Qasem Soleimani killing. Now, stay tuned to consider this. Hello, welcome back to Consider This. Melisa and Sharaad here with you. Now, Iran is vowing revenge after US airstrikes on Friday killed General Qasem Soleimani, commander of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force. Now, thousands of American troops are now heading to the Middle East as tensions with Tehran escalate. To help us better understand the diplomatic fallout, we have joining us on the line Guy Burton, adjunct professor in international relations at Vesalius College in Brussels. Thank you for joining us, Guy. Now, my first question to you is, Qasem Soleimani has been around for a while now as a prominent US antagonist in the region. So why kill him now? I mean, do you think US politics played a role in this decision against, a backdrop of the impeachment trial as well as this being an election year?
Yes, well, thank you very much for having me on your show. That's a very good question, because I think that's really what's starting to be asked now that sort of the fallout of the killings happened. The Americans have effectively said that part of the reason for going after him now was that he constituted an imminent threat to American interests. But it is interesting that the initial statement that was put out by the Pentagon did not mention anything about it being imminent, and that seems to have come about more recently. Part of the reason for that is because often, in international law, being able to take this kind of action, you would need to demonstrate that kind of imminency or that sort of urgency for it to happen. However, it's very likely that actually, if you set this in the context of American policy towards Iran over the last year and a half, they have been exerting maximum pressure since the decision to withdraw from the nuclear deal and the decision to increase sanctions. So in a sense, you could argue that this killing is pretty much sort of in line with the ratcheting up of that maximum pressure strategy.
Guy, a Kuwaiti newspaper a year ago reported that Washington had given Israel, the Mossad, a green light to assassinate Soleimani. Was this, or is it believed to be a joint Israeli-American operation?
We don't know so much at the moment as to whether the Americans did this in conjunction with anyone else. In fact, it's very difficult in the United States to even know, the reasoning behind it. Certainly, the Democrats, for example, late last night were asking questions as to, what was the basis on which the Americans took this action. And so they're asking questions. And certainly, the detail hasn't really come out. And we know that, for example, the Americans didn't really involve their own allies. In Britain, for example, there was a sense that the government was overlooked. So in this sense, it does seem a little bit like the Americans, took the initiative here. Whether they did that in partnership with someone else like the Israelis, it's not yet clear. But certainly we know that it's primarily an American action.
All right. Guy, I want to come back to something you said a bit earlier about, the sense of urgency surrounding this. Now, there seems to be ongoing this semantic conversation about whether this was an assassination or was it not, whether it was lawful or legal. Now, what do you think? I mean, the U.S. labeled this a terrorist organization, more than a year ago. So does that give them a right to do the killing?
Yes, in April 2019, the Americans designated the Revolutionary Guards in Iraq, the military wing of as a terrorist organization. And a lot of sort of kerfuffle was made at the time about that. But I think you need to set that into context, because Iran itself has been designated a state sponsor of terrorism by the United States since 1984 at least. So it's, in a way, there's not much that makes the designation of the IRGC, significant. I mean, in that sense, it was more about increasing the possibility of sanctions against individuals there. Now, in terms of the actual killing, I mean, we know that in international law, the United Nations recognizes that action can be taken if it's in self-defense. Certainly, Article 51 allows that to happen. But the problem is, of course, the relationship between the United States and Iran. As they are not in an official form of war. There hasn't been a declaration of war. So it's very difficult to say that the United States has the legality to be able to take the action that it did. And certainly a number of people who are familiar with this area of extrajudicial killings, have raised some doubts as to whether the United States really had the position or the claim that it said it had. It's also, of course, worth noting that the United States itself has a decree, an executive order from 1976 that doesn't allow it to have political assassination. That was obviously in the aftermath of going after Fidel Castro in Cuba. But of course, over the decades since, we've seen increasing use by American presidents to widen its latitude when it comes to attacking those that it's opposed to. And we've also seen, including under the previous administration, the Obama administration, the use of drones for airstrikes against targeted individuals. So
Guy, can I interrupt you at this point? While Soleimani is hailed as a hero in Iran, but we know, of course, also there's divided opinion about him in the exile community of Iranians. It is also said that he was the mastermind of Iran's, asymmetrical warfare strategy that included funding Iraqi militia to go after American targets. Now, the numbers that we have is some 600 U.S. servicemen were killed using the strategy. So in some ways, Soleimani is himself not, his hands are not clear of blood. I mean, is this the reason why they needed to go after him? Because he was so effective in attacking Americans?
Yeah, and I think this is one of the things about the Iranian military approach has been effectively they are, I mean, in terms of sort of conventional forces, relatively weak. And if you were going to take on the United States, they're not really in a position to do that. So they've had to exploit their own mechanisms, their different approaches that would be most appropriate to them. So they have made use of sort of asymmetric warfare, working with parties like, as you pointed out, the paramilitary groups in Iraq, which they've got influence over, which they've armed. Similarly, they've done the same with the Hezbollah in Lebanon, with its own sort of paramilitary group in Syria, the Houthis to a lesser extent in Yemen. So there has been a sort of a building of influence and taking advantage of, in a way, where there is a certain degree of instability or volatility within those countries. So the Iranians have been pretty effective in that regard. And in terms of thinking about, we've also heard a little bit about the Iranians talking about hitting back. And it's very likely that will probably be the same approach that they will take. It will probably be somewhere like Iraq, which is somewhat weak and has already American targets there.
Right. So, Guy, you're saying that you expect Iran to hit back through, say, a proxy war fought on Iraqi soil. Is that right?
I mean, that's one possibility. I mean, another way could also be through the use of cyber warfare. What Iran has been doing is ratcheting up its ability to exploit basically building up its highly high-tech individuals who are able to work with hacking into government agencies or into primary businesses. So you might see different approaches taken there, always kind of at the level of potential deniability. We've also seen in the last year, especially in the American maximum pressure approach, we've seen the Iranians trying to use their own proxies, work with other parties to hit not just at Americans, but American allies. So, for example, the pipeline attack or the attack on the oil processing installation in Saudi Arabia, both of those were done by drone attacks, which Houthis claimed it was their action. Although you might very well see the Iranian hands behind that.
Right, Guy, last question. We have about a minute left. Trump has come out to say 52 targets on Iranian soil of great value to the Iranians. Do you think this administration in particular, I know Mike Pompeo has come out to say they will play by the international rules, but do you think Trump will observe the niceties? Why not attack Iran directly if it serves its purposes?
Sorry, to attack Iran or to attack
Iran directly? Why not attack Iran directly?
Well, I think that to do that would be to really ratchet up the confrontation. I mean, let's be clear. This regime is not necessarily a loved regime. But as we've seen, the sheer numbers of people that have been out on the streets, in response to the killing and following the funeral procession. Now, it's unlikely that they are all, diehard supporters of the regime. But we've got to see this as in a nationalistic way. An attack on Iran would be a direct attack on the Iranian people, and that, of course, would lead to a nationalist uprising. So I think the Americans would be playing with fire if they were to target Iran directly.
Right. Thank you so much for speaking with us, Guy, and sharing your insights. Now we'll be back with more on Consider This. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Consider This. Melisa and Sharaad here with you tonight. Here's what we want you to consider. Ricky Gervais has returned as the host of the Golden Globes this year and had lots to say in his opening monologue. But there was one particularly awkward moment where he called up pretty much everyone in the room. Here's a snippet of what he said.
So, well, you say you're woke, but the companies you work for, I mean, unbelievable. Apple, Amazon, Disney. If ISIS started a streaming service, you'd call your agent, wouldn't you? So, if you do win an award tonight, don't use it as a platform to make a political speech, right? You're in no position to lecture the public about anything. You know nothing about the real world. Most of you spent less time in school than Greta Thunberg. So, if you win, right, come up, accept your little award, thank your agent.
That was Ricky Gervais at the Golden Globes, I think, last night. Now, clearly, he's very upset, saying that celebrities don't have a moral leg to stand on in coming up and giving a political message should they win an award.
Yeah, I think what he's playing on is the blowback over the kind of purity test that seems to be very important to the woke generation. They apply to everybody, perhaps not as rigorously to themselves. So he's playing on that. I don't think, we could take him at face value. Because, Melisa, do you think that if you're not, in fact, pure, that you can't, in fact, take political positions?
No, I definitely not. And what I've noticed is that a lot of the celebrities who have won awards at the Golden Globes shied away from making political comments, perhaps, worried that Ricky Gervais might come after them. But what they did was, in fact, went for something somewhat non-partisan, which is about the climate crisis. Now, a lot of celebrities came out and said, well, shining light on what's happening in Australia, calling for help, calling for awareness, which I think is great. If you have a celebrity platform, why not, try and make it a better place, right?
Except that, I think, in fact, the environmental issue is a political one. You see Donald Trump, siding with deniers, Scott Morrison in Australia, siding with deniers or, skeptics about it, because the blowback has been very, very real for them. But yes, I think the environment is deeply political. I'm glad those actors did, in fact, take a position.
All right, there you go. Okay, that's all the time we have for this episode of Consider This. We'll be back same time tomorrow night with another episode. I'm Melisa Idris, with me, Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for tonight. Thank you for watching.